Hello everyone, and welcome to your Masters in Management. Today we're going to be speaking about operations management. And we're here with Dr. Silvio De Bono, who'll be sharing his managerial experience with us today. Dr. De Bono, thank you for being with us. My first question is the usual generic introductory question. What is the definition of operations management?
Thank you very much, Sandy. I think this is a fundamental question, though it's a generic question, it's a fundamental question. Operations is one of the functional areas of management. Finance is another, HR is another, sales and marketing is another. Operations is a fundamental area in the study of management and management theories. Essentially, operations management is the transfer of either raw material into a product or the transfer into an idea into execution. So operations management involves people, processes, and outputs. Okay. Operations management is therefore a fundamental concept practically in each and every organization, irrespective whether this is a service-oriented or a manufacturing-oriented or a hybrid organization. Because ultimately, an organization is there to provide a service or a product. Let me give you an example. Mm-hmm. Because in some instances, for example, some organizations are providing both a service and a product. A very simple thing. You go to a restaurant. A lot of operations is involved over there because people in the kitchen, they need to get the food, the raw material, they need to cook it and present it to you. There's a whole operational activity there. The operational activity, as a matter of fact, does not start from the kitchen. The operation activity starts from the procurement, or the operational activity starts from the marketing. And these all the different functional areas are tightly knit to each other. But that's not only it. Because in the same restaurant, you are also making use of a service. So the operational activity there involves that you entering the restaurant, probably you calling before for a reservation, taking your reservation appropriately, because if they took the reservation and it was not correct, then it's overbooked. And that's not nice.
Not at all.
So you go to this restaurant, you actually are given the table at the right time. You are served at the right time, in the right way, and you got your food appropriately when it is due, because you could be served the best food ever, but it takes too long. So operations is putting together the different resources. We started off by defining operations management as the transfer of a raw material or idea into a product or a service. In order to be able to execute the full cycle of operations management, a lot of resources are employed. There are the human resources mostly, there's the technical resources, and the raw material. All these resources need to be employed simultaneously and contemporaneously in a synchronized manner and in a synchronized manner. Failing to do that, your operations would suffer. As a matter of fact, a number of organizations are usually judged by the way they serve, by the way they operate. Mostly their operations management is the one which is looked into. A lot of, for example, you go to a very simple thing. You go to a restaurant once again, and you are asked to fill in their customer service questionnaire. What are you looking into? The operations. Mm-hmm. You're in a hotel and you're asked to fill in the guest questionnaire. One of the items which is being looked into is not only the cleanliness of the room, and that requires operation. Mm-hmm. It's not only the way you're being served at the reception, and that requires operation. It's also the person who's helping you in transferring your luggages from the reception to your room, and that also requires operation. It requires, it assesses the way you are treated in a restaurant. And that also, each and every part of the activity is an operational activity. So essentially, there's no business without activity. Essentially, there's no business without an operation. Operation management is, contrary to what people think, however, is not only the operations department which is responsible for it. The operations department could be responsible, could be looking into the critical core component. But operations management, and I've used the term synchronized earlier on, needs to be completely synchronized. And from the early beginning of the conceptualization of the idea till the very end of the execution, all the different parts needs to be synchronized together. One of the major pitfalls that we find today is that, notwithstanding all the effort that we did over the last years, a lot of organizations are still very functional. And the functionality in organization still creates a lot of this silo mentality. Still creates a lot of this idea where I do my part and the other department would do its part independently and separately from what I'm doing. There is where operations fails. Imagine in this particular restaurant that I've mentioned earlier on, that someone took your reservation, but that was not properly written in the log sheet for the next day. Imagine that the kitchen did not look into how many guests do we have for breakfast the day after. Imagine that this was not rightly communicated to the procurement officer to prepare the raw material. Imagine if the stores were not clean enough and the raw material could not be placed in the stores. Imagine if the cleaners were not there and therefore, it wasn't tidy enough and there was some contamination. Yeah. So did we say something which is separated from another? No. So operations management involves the whole organizational activity. And this needs to be looked into in this particular way.
Okay. What would you say are the steps in the operations management approach?
Okay, to simplify matter, because there are a number of theoretical issues. But to simplify matter, I would say that there are three major steps. And as you know, we in consulting, we use them quite often, which is the input, the process, and the output. And we need to say something about each and every one of them. The input process, the first step is the input process, which is the input of resources, the input of ideas, the input of anything within a machine. Now, the machine could either be the organization, the machine could either be the human being. If I'm selling ideas, my input is ideas from other areas. If I'm selling consulting work, my ideas is what I've learned elsewhere. My ideas are generated through research. My ideas are generated through other work. So we constantly need input as an individual and as an organization. The input needs to be then stored, and stored in a particular way which could be used at any point in time. For example, if we manage as an individual to get a lot of ideas and they're stored somewhere, but they cannot be retrieved, that's useless. Yes. Why? Because it's like, you had a paper somewhere in your office, you need it at this particular point in time, but you cannot retrieve it. Even though that paper is highly valuable, it has no value at this particular point in time, because it would have value if you would have managed to retrieve it when you need it. So at an individual level, inputs are the ideas that we get, is the knowledge, and we put that in a reserve bucket. From a manufacturing perspective or an operational perspective where products are required, The inputs is generated, is looked into from procurement purposes. For example, we buy resources, we store resources, and we keep them there for when we need them. Now, efficiency and effectiveness in operations management has brought about a number of theories of how to procure and how to store. Because, procurement is expensive and storing is even more expensive. So what do? We procure in different methodologies. For example, the just-in-time process is a methodology process where you procure what you need to procure. So you need it, you use it when you particularly need it. The questions which we raise in this module are, for example, can countries like Malta, which we're an island state, and we depend on the connectivity, on the marine connectivity to get most of our products, work on a just-in-time system? Should other systems be employed at that particular point in time? So when we are studying the operations management module, and we're looking into the input part, there's a lot of theories and constructs which needs to be identified. In principle, it boils to the same thing. You have resources which are obtained and stored. Then we go to the second part. And the second part is the process. The process is probably the most critical part of it all. And the reason why I'm saying this is because at the process point of view, that resource needs to be transferred into something else. For example, in pharmaceutical industry, you get the different ingredients and you transfer them into a medicinal. In a restaurant, you're getting the different items, different food items, and you're turning them into a delicious plate, something which you enjoy eating, In any other manufacturing concern, you're taking plastics and turning it into something else. But that process involves a lot of other activity, involves engineering activity, involves IT activity, involves artificial intelligence activity, involves a lot of data analysis activity, involves a lot of competency frameworks, involves HR to provide you with the right people, involves training and development to ensure that the right competencies are in place. The amount of activity which is involved in the operational part is enormous, which varies from one company to another, but the principal activity is employing then the human and technical resources to change that raw resource into a product. So the raw resource, as we have explained it earlier on, is the input. Turning that raw resource into an output is the operational activity. From one company to another, the operational activities varies considerably. Part of the effort that companies are doing today, and this is not only in the manufacturing industry, but as well in the service industry, is that we try as much as possible to use technology, to employ technology, to ensure standardization and automation for efficiency and effectiveness. Meaning what? Meaning that all those activities which can be technologically driven become cheaper in the long run, they are better, and they are produced in the shortest possible time frame. And most of the activities are turned this way. So far we thought that this was only applicable in the manufacturing concern. Today, we also understand that this type of activity is not only used in manufacturing, but this principle is now being adopted in the service industry as well. And the idea is to let humans do the thinking process and let computers do the other work. And it's amazing, how much we can use the brain power for decision making, we can use the brain power for innovation, we can use the brain power for other things, even in the service industry, but make use of technology and artificial intelligence in this case to actually replace the human to do even part of the thinking skills. Now, yes, there's ethics involved, which I don't think we can go into at this point in time, but that would be an interesting subject. The third part of the operational process is the output. Ultimately, we're doing all this process to do something. So the idea is ultimately turned into a report, or the idea is ultimately turned into a recommendation which needs to be implemented. The raw materials are ultimately transferred into a product. You know, some different plastics are manufactured and they're transferred into a spare part for a car or one of the appliances we have at home. So there's a whole operational activity which is directly involved. Students following this module need to particularly understand that the input process and output flow is applicable in everything we do. And part of the essentials for students following this module is to identify how different industries along the years have changed their operational flow to achieve better efficiency and effectiveness at the place of work. And why am I saying this? Because the competitiveness of any organization does not only depend on the ultimate product, but it also depends on the ability to reach a high-level product with the lowest possible cost and the shortest possible time. And most of companies constantly re-engineer their business process. We're quite familiar, as you well know, with this word. Re-engineering the business processes, re-engineering how we do work, re-engineering what we do, re-engineering even technology and bringing new, more modern technology to achieve better, shortest time frame and lowest cost. This is the challenge, and this is why operations management has become a functional subject which is studied independently from all other management subjects, because it is the study of ensuring that companies become more competitive in what they do. And not only in what they do, but even more in how they actually achieve it.
So for my next question, which of the operations management key performance targets are necessary to remain in business?
We usually say that anything which you cannot measure, you cannot manage. Mm-hmm. For any business to remain successful, for any business to be able to measure up to its level of performance, it needs to ensure that each and every part of the business activity is measured. And this is what we refer to as employing proper business metrics at the place of work. What is a business metric? A business metric is nothing but a measurement. Let me give for an example. You would be talking to a receptionist and to understand his or her work, and they would say, we receive a lot of phone calls every day. Mm-hmm. And your task as a consultant is to try and find out what type of calls is this person receiving. Whether you can transfer those calls today into a chatbot. Because if he or she is having a number of questions and they're all the same, today you can also get a computer to do that. So you'll be more efficient, effective, and no time is wasted at all. But you would go there to this receptionist and you would ask him or her, how many phone calls do you get a day? That's a metric. That's a measurement. Because it's either getting 1,000 calls a day, it's either getting 1,000 calls a month, or it's either getting 1,000 calls a year. You're still getting 1,000 calls, but over a different time frame. Because through that number, you can start making analysis and decisions. A very important source of using metrics in operations management is getting information, getting data, translating data to information. So from data is just numbers. You analyze, you group those numbers into information, you turn that information into knowledge, and you turn that knowledge into a decision. This is part of the data flow operations which is required in developing metrics. At each and every point, there should be different metrics. And a good consultant, as you well know, a good person working in operations management would take the different nodes, because a process is made up of different nodes. What first would have to look into the whole process and would need to map the process, which is quite a laborious process. By mapping the process, you would then identify the key nodes, and for every key node there would be a metric. How many calls you're getting, what type of calls are you getting? For example, you're getting 50 calls a day. 25 of these calls are requesting information, 10 of these calls are wrong number. What else? 25 and 10, that's 35. The other 15 calls are, I don't know, requests for something else. So you know that what type of calls you're getting. So you can start building your operation according to what you're having there. You know, for example, that you are developing a campaign and all of a sudden you realize that instead of having 50 calls a day, you're having 150 calls a day. And 100 of these calls is requesting more information. Can one person handle this? If you're not going to have one person to handle this information, do you need two? Is it worth it having two people? Can you train someone else to do it? And this is just from one activity. This is just from one activity of having metrics. Now, when you have different metrics at different nodes, you build the whole story. So you would identify the level of inefficiency, you would identify the level of ineffectiveness, you would identify why there is level of ineffectiveness. Is it a competence related issue? Is it because technology is not helping? Is it both? Is it because you've got an influx at a particular period but then you've got a low period later on, you've got a lull? So through the analysis of the different nodes, through the analysis of the different metrics at each particular node, you would get a whole picture. Once you get the whole picture, then you can identify where are you doing well and what are the areas that you need to look into. Once you identify the areas that you need to look into, then you start pinpointing the actions that you need to take at that particular point in time in that particular instance. And there is where you start building different combinations. In some instances, you know, particularly where there's a lot of manufacturing concern, this is where different algorithms would need to take place in order to build the different permutations of how to improve your product and service in a timely, efficient, and cost-effective manner. One area which I need to emphasize, however, is the difference between the economies of scope and the economies of scale. Because when we think about operations and when we think about production, very often we only think about economies of scale, that it is more worth it to produce 1,000 products than 100 products. Potentially and presumably that is true. And in big markets, in big economies, where economies of scale have a higher demand, it is more probable that a company would design its operational activities based on economies of scale. This is highly applicable. There are certain instances in smaller economies, in more limited markets, where economies of scale are not true. They don't give the best result. Why? Because, for example, the market is extremely limited in terms of numbers. So there is where economies of scope kicks in. Now, in economies of scope, it's not the numbers, but it's how you're providing it. In certain instances in Malta, because though there is a booming economy, but it remains a limited market. In certain instances, the operations activity is more based, or should be based even more, on principles of economies of scope and not on principles of economies of scale. Generally, when you're basing your operations on economies of scope, it tends to be a bit more expensive. And this explains why in certain items, why certain activities, why certain issues in Malta are a bit more complex. Because you still have to produce the best, you still have to produce efficiently, but you may not necessarily have the numbers that other countries do have. And this is why, for example, in different industries like printing, like in the fast food industry, we cannot always meet the same level of activity in terms of competitiveness as bigger countries, because the economies of scale in our regards are completely different. And this, I think that through this question and through metrics, we need also to explain this particular difference, which is very much related to a small island state like we are. There are companies in Malta which are directly affiliated to international brands. And therefore they may have higher economies of scope and scale rather than scope, because most of their product is exported. So there, they still work on economies of scale. I'm not going to mention companies, but with some reflection, we can identify them. So we've got the big companies who still work on economies of scale, notwithstanding that they're working in Malta. So the base is Malta, but the product is exported. So both are required and both needs to be understood.
Does an operation strategy change in time?
It should. I don't think that there's any strategy which should remain static.
Okay.
The ultimate objectives of the strategy, or rather the ultimate objectives that one needs to reach, would remain the same, as I've explained earlier on. Ultimately, a good operations manager keeps on asking the same question. How can I achieve the best product, the best time frame, and the lowest cost? This would remain, unchanged. But the way to do it changes regularly. And I give you two examples. One is when you have an internally driven change in the organization, so you need to change your strategy, your operation strategy. And one when you have external changes in the external changes, i.e. in the market, external to the organization, and you still need to change your internal operation strategy. So the ultimate aim, the ultimate objective, the reason that of why we're doing it remains the same, as I explained earlier on. But how to achieve that, it's constantly changing. For example, if externally a new technology has been brought into the organization, you cannot keep on using the same operational strategy with the introduction of a new technology which is probably more efficient. Yeah. So that needs to change. The marketing department must have thought about it earlier on to ensure that it markets this even more intelligently. If, for example, there are changes, external changes in the legal framework or in the regulatory framework, that brings about internal changes in the organization. And you understand, not only manufacturing concerns, but there could be a number, as you well know, a lot of regulatory changes in the finance industry. That is changing the way banks are, for example, managing themselves. The way other financial institutions are changing even their internal operational activity to meet changes in the regulatory framework. So if we think that we develop an operations strategy, and that operations strategy is cast in stone, and it will never change, and it will not change, and it's there to stay, I think it's a very good recipe for disaster. On the other hand, A good operation strategy needs to be constantly, and the word constantly is bold, underlined, italics, needs to be constantly updated, in the sense that it needs to, whoever is responsible for this operation strategy needs to constantly analyze the internal and the external realities through different methodologies. In this module, we'll be explaining methodologies like how to analyze the internal organization, the SWOT analysis, the TOWS analysis, using the Pastel and Pastelli analysis for the external market, using Kotter's model for different analysis. So we'll be looking into how we can apply different theoretical management models to understand both the internal and the external market realities, and in doing so, a good operational strategist would immediately change how operations need to be achieved. And this, as I said, I'm repeating it, applies both to the service, to the manufacturing, and undoubtedly to the hybrid structures, as well. So a definite answer to your question is no. Strategies are not, particularly operational strategies, are not something which are cast in stone, but are something which constantly need to change.
Okay.
And adapt themselves according, the last part, and adapt themselves to the realities of the industry and of the organization. We could say more to this maybe later on.
Okay. On the other hand, does the operations management process have any limitations?
Limitations are always omnipresent. One of the major limitations is that I wish I can do a lot of things, but I haven't got the resources to do it. And we all have limitations. We all want to achieve more, we all want to achieve better, we want to prosper faster. Generally, theory suggests that there are three types of limitations: human, technical, and financial. Let us start with the first one. These are just to mention the major limitations. Out of these, we can then elicit other type of limitations as well. From a operational strategic perspective, the strategist would identify, for example, a set of competences that need to be present in the organization. For example, what's coming to my mind at this point in time is in the financial industry. And in this particular industry, and the role of an actuarial need to be looked into very seriously. The number of actuarials available, not only in Malta, is quite limited. But notwithstanding, the actuarial job and the actuarial competences, which are highly numeric, needs to be present in every organization. So companies there, for example, realize that in order to be able to reach their strategies, they need to anticipate and they need to control their financial risk extremely high. The role of the actuarial there is required. If they cannot have it internally, they would need to subcontract that externally, potentially even outside Malta, at a much higher cost. So that competence limitation has brought about a higher cost to the ultimate operation. So you can understand that competency limitations are quite extensive. And the role of any country in an emerging economy and in a booming economy is to constantly keep on updating itself by looking into the new competences that are going to be required not next year, but in 5, 10 years' time. Unfortunately, we don't always do this. On the contrary, sometimes we are very much concerned with the immediate. Sometimes we're not even recognizing how things are changing. For example, just to mention a case in point, is that in Malta we are having an elderly population. And over the next 10, 15 years, demography shows, and you don't have to be an expert to realize this, but just by looking into the signs of the times, demography shows that over the next 10, 15 years, the elderly population is going to increase rapidly. The question is, do we have the right competences from the health sector? I'm not saying we don't. Do we have the right competences for the nursing profession to deal with this elderly population? And are we trained to meet the new requirements? Is our construction industry realizing that a high percentage of our elderly they still need to live in homes? Are our elderly homes being built with this in mind? So just even a change in demography, for example, brings with it a set of new competences. So the human limitation, the competence limitation is there, not only in terms of competence, also in terms of numbers. Mm-hmm. Do we have enough? Yeah. So not only whether we have competent, but do we have enough people to actually carry out a particular job? This is one of the reasons why we are having a lot of foreign employees in Malta working in different levels in different aspects. It's not bad, on the contrary, it's good, it's warranted, it's needed. And this is not related to competency, this is related to actually numbers. You would speak to some managers and owners and entrepreneurs in different businesses, in different sectors, and in fact they would tell you they would like to grow their business, but one of the reasons why they are failing to grow their business is because they can't find the right people, or they can't find enough people, or they can't find enough people with the right competences to do the job. So yes, undoubtedly, and it's a very good question, undoubtedly the human element brings with it some limitations which directly or indirectly, willingly or unwillingly, knowingly or unknowingly, it leaves a huge impact on the operational part of the whole process. Another limitation is the financial limitation. And I don't know any organization which does not claim this. We would all like to do better things. We would all like to do things and bring the best technology on board. But whatever you need to do, there are companies that I know and can come to mind that are constantly telling me, I would like to grow the business, and the overall business strategy is a growth strategy. But can they financially sustain that growth? Gone are those days when you would just go to a bank or any other financial institution for that matters, and you would get a loan unless you can prove through good business planning that the loan or the overdraft or the financial assistance which you're getting is going to pay off. Also because the banks have their own external regulatory framework which is being more stringent, and that's the way it should be at the end of the day. But nevertheless, the financial, or at least the immediate financial resources, brings along some issues in every operational activity. Though I still think that the human part is the most critical part at this point in time. Then, in addition to the human and the financial, I personally, and I'm using much more experience rather than the theoretical framework here, I think that technology is also a limitation. When I say technology, I don't only mean the ability to purchase, the ability to procure, the ability to buy technology, but I'm looking into whether the existing technology meets the desired need. The innovation, has there been enough innovation in a particular technological frame which constantly improves the product and the output? There are some areas where technology has improved exponentially. There are other areas where technology has not improved so exponentially, even in the same industry. For example, if we take health as an industry, there are some areas where technology has improved exponentially and has made the cure of patients much and much easier and much faster. But there are certain other areas where there has not been the same rate and rhythm and progress in technological improvement. And I still know of people in the medical profession, just to mention the medical profession, the same applies in finance, the same applies in other areas, where they would still like the other desire to improve, but there's that particular limitation. So to summarize, to answer your direct question here, are there limitations? I would say yes. Can I categorize them? Personally, I categorize them in the human, and the technical, and in the financial.
All right, thanks for that. Now I'd like to move on to techniques. What techniques are, in your opinion, most appropriate for managing flow, capacity, and inventory?
Okay, when you say techniques, some books, some theories refer as techniques, some books, techniques refer as methods. Basically, we are talking whether we are adopting a just-in-time system, whether adopting a LIFO system or a FIFO system. These are techniques, these are methods, these are tools, which are there, which are used, and which are used according to the different organization, according to a particular point in time. The general idea behind a technique is the ability to work with that technique. Let me give you an example. For some employees, the best thing, the best scenario would be where you need a product, you go to the store, you find it, you use it, and you don't have to think about it. But that requires a lot of resources, a lot of money, a lot of space. The question is, that increases cost. So what these different techniques are actually doing, or the application of these different techniques, is in order to ensure that at the end of the day, the customer would still get what it requires, but at a cheaper price and potentially at a better quality. So irrespective and irrelevant which technique you're using, the client at the very end of the process chain is not interested in which technique you're using. Let me give you a practical example. I mean, all of us here drive, notwithstanding that we're trying to control the traffic flow, but we find it very convenient to drive from one part to another. And for a particular reason, you need a particular part of your car. You go to your supplier, and your supplier would tell you, because I use a just-in-time system, and once that you have applied for it now, you need to wait, for example, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days for me to get this part, to get it using freight, or if it needs to be shipped, you need 2 weeks. What would be your concern? I don't care what you're doing. Your concern would be, I need this particular item now, because without it, I'm stranded. Customers are not generally concerned with the tools, with the methods that companies use. Companies adopt and adapt one or more technique according to their ability, according to their limitations as well. If I'm limited in resources, if I'm limited in financial resources, if I'm limited in the logistical resources where I store, I cannot all of a sudden ensure to procure 100 items and keep them over store. First of all, it's expensive. Secondly, I don't have any place where to put them. So through what I've said earlier on, remember, data, you turn that information, you turn that into knowledge, you turn that into a decision. So using that past data, companies should realize what system they need to use in order to ensure 3 things. 1, customer satisfaction. 2, keeping the whole process low in cost. And 3, keep it efficient. Because in such a competitive world, if repetitively you're going to your car supplier and your car supplier will tell you, sorry Sandy, but we don't have this part. The next day you say, sorry Sandy, but we don't have this part. When you're thinking of getting your new car, you would say, do I really want to go here? Or would I go somewhere else where if I need a service, I'm going to get it? So there needs to be this constant trade-off, for a choice of a better word, between how I'm going to meet this client needs and how much this is going to cost me. The techniques which you have referred to are the tools. And I'm sure you understand that tools are there to be used. If we use tools properly, we generally get a better result. If we use tools as the buy and all, and the tool become more important than the output, then we may not be reaching result, because some of the resistance to change has always been where people would say, we have always used this particular tool. They wouldn't say tool. They would say, we have always worked this way, and why should we change it now? And our job would be, but can you look in a better tool which would give you a better result, but it would be cheaper? And the resistance is undoubtedly going to be there, because if you have been doing things for such a long time, it becomes habitual rather than, you don't have to be, it becomes effortless, you don't have to think about it. And this is why, yes, while tools are critical, while tools are important, while tools are imperative to have, tools remain tools. Yes. And therefore, it is the applicability of tools which is important, and not only the, make tools the buy and all in that operational process.
Okay, thank you. And for my last question today, Dr. De Bono, is it true that the key to making quality products is to develop quality people?
Undoubtedly, a very big yes.
Okay.
Whatever we do, we've mentioned restaurants. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, it's all about people. Mm-hmm. It's not only about food, it's about the experience. You can go on a holiday. It's not only about the places that we visit, but it's the experience that we get from people around us. You may be in a hospital. It's not only the high level of health service quality that we receive from our hospitals, because that is for granted. Mm-hmm. We expect that, we don't even argue about it, but it's how that is provided. Just think about one service where the person is not directly involved. At this time, we also say that even those services where there's no direct human involvement, the human still remains responsible for it. When we've mentioned earlier on the involvement of artificial intelligence and how ethical is that. Mm-hmm. This is what exactly I had in mind as well. One of the new developments we were discussing at the office earlier this week was, the development of artificial intelligence in cars. So now you can have cars driving around without human intervention. So you just plug in the destination and the car would take you. Fine, but if there's an accident, how ethical is it to actually put the blame on technology? Mm-hmm. Or should you put the blame on the other driver? And if you've got one car which is being driven by artificial intelligence and another car which is being driven by a human, who's going to get the blame? How are you going to determine who's got the blame? So at the end of the day, the ethical, moral, valuable consideration that in any business process, ultimately the human remains the sole responsible person to ensure that the mission and vision of the organization is reached through the good quality, cost-effective service or product remains very valid. To answer your question, it's not only yes, and it's not only a yes that is going to be in force now, but we've been experiencing changes in management and in management theories as long as, people started employing others. From the turn of the feudalism system to the employment system, The essence was to come up with new theories, to come up with new ways of working, to find this ever-changing concept of how we achieve more with less. This has always been the question which a lot of theoreticians have tried to achieve, whether they are the behaviorist theoreticians, whether they are the scientific theoreticians, whether they are the motivational theorists, the content or the process theories. It has always been the same. How can we achieve the best product with less effort and with less money? In operations management, even if we try as much as we can to change from the human to the technical, the personal human experience would remain at the forefront. And I can't say this to change. Ultimately, humans love humans.
That's right. Okay, that concludes the questions I have for you, Dr. De Bono.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank you for your time with us. So there you have it. Today we spoke about operations management, where we defined what is operations management and the steps involved in the operations management process. We looked into the limitations that the process has, and we ended with tying in operations management with quality. That's it for today. Thank you, and see you next time.